Okay, so we're going to finish off the series on consuming a REST API in Flutter by me showing you how to basically automate writing of these services. So writing these services, or actually writing code to communicate with an API, it doesn't have to be called a service, but writing this code is always going to be very time consuming to do, because if it's a simple API where you have maybe one model, it really doesn't matter. But when your API grows and when your app grows, you're going to have to write a lot of this stuff, which is just not good because it's work that can be automated. And usually if you have to write code to communicate between your front-end application and your backend, you should probably find a way to automate it. And there are multiple ways to automating this type of stuff, but one we were going to look at is basically code generating our way into having these services working. And also we're going to remove this API response class, but we're going to use a response class from the library I'm going to add right now, which has some more data and is a bit more powerful than this custom thing we wrote. Okay, and the library we're going to use is called Chopper. So Chopper is a library that can help us generate services that communicate with APIs automatically. And if you look at the documentation, basically you just define how you want your service to look by adding these abstract methods. So you don't provide the implementation, you just say, okay, this is a GET request to this URL, this is what I'm sending, and this is the response I'm expecting. Wait, let me zoom in. So it's very simple to use. You just define these kind of API calls, and then you just have to run a simple command, and it's going to generate code for you, just like we did with JSON serializable. So as you can see here, we defined a model called notes for listing, and we automated the conversion from a map to an object and from an object to a map. So that's also what we're going to do in here, just for API calls. We're not converting anything, we're just calling the API and parsing the data to a response. Okay, so let's get started by installing the Chopper library. First, we have to add a dependency that's called Chopper, and I'm going to use the version 301. This is the one that works for me the best. And also, I'm going to add a Chopper generator library under dev dependencies. So this is also what we need. Okay, and now when I save my file, it should automatically install the packages because I'm using Visual Studio Code. Okay, and the next thing we should do is we should rework our NoteService to be compliant with Chopper, so Chopper can generate all of the code we need. So the first thing I'm going to do is import the Chopper library right here. And here I'm getting an error that Chopper does not exist. This is because Visual Studio Code does not immediately recognize the libraries I install. So I'm going to close Visual Studio Code and I'm going to reopen it. Okay, so now the error is gone. So the next thing we should do is add a part command here. And this part command basically says that this NoteService, that the code generated from NoteService is going to be put into here. And your file has to be called whatever it's called right here, .chopper.dart. Otherwise, Chopper won't generate your code for you. If you remember, this is the same thing we did in our JSON serializable video. We say part noteinsert.g.dart, and then in the g.dart file is all the generated code. That's also going to be the case for our NoteService. So now it's reporting an error since the file does not exist, but once we run the code generation tools, it's all going to just fix itself. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is to make the NoteService abstract, which just means that the functions in there do not need to have an implementation. So we can say abstract. And another thing we need to do to make this work is to make it extend the extends and make it extend the Chopper service. And the last thing we need to do to the service itself is to add a Chopper API annotation. Again, just like JSON serializable, Chopper has its own annotations that it uses to take whatever code we have here and generate some more code. And here we put in the base URL. So we can put the base URL to be the entire URL of the API /notes, but it's typically best practice just to have the regular path and then configure the base URL URL in a different place, and I'm going to show you how to do that as we move on in the video. Okay, so the next thing we need to do is we need to modify all of the methods we have. So as I said, in the abstract class, a method does not need to have an implementation, and Chopper will look for those methods in a Chopper service class. So in order to have our code generated, we need to remove the implementation body, and we also need to change the type from API response, because that's our own custom class, to a response class. And a response class, if you take a look here, is part of the Chopper library. And this response class will contain a lot of stuff. Body, it will contain an error if there is one. It can tell us the status code. It can tell us if the request was successful and all that type of stuff. So this is what we're going to be using now. And we're going to ditch the API response class we made a couple of videos ago. And I'm also going to do it for all of these methods over here. And we're going to keep the response types the same. So now let's also remove implementations for everything else here. Okay, and now these are just declarations of these methods. And Chopper is going to take these declarations, and based on some more data we give it right now, it's going to generate the implementations. You'll see. So if you look in the Chopper documentation, there are a couple of things that we can also add to the methods we have. So we can put in the HTTP method we want to send, which could be get, post, put, delete, and that type of stuff. We can put in a body as a parameter. I'm just not sure where it's at in the documentation. And we can also add variables to the path. So what we're going to do now is we're going to annotate everything that needs to be annotated in our methods so Chopper can generate appropriate clients for it. So first, the getNotesList method. It's just a get method. So we need to add the get annotation, and we're not going to add anything to the path because it hits directly the /notes endpoint. And since we're not sending anything, there are not any more annotations we need to add. However, with our getNote method, it becomes a bit more complicated. It's also a get method, but it also contains the note ID. So when we want to get a specific node, we send a request that's going to be like API/notes, and then we're going to pass the ID that we have. So since we cannot hard code that, we can add these curly braces and define a variable, just like it was done here in the documentation. And then we can link this variable we declared to a parameter we pass. And the way we're going to link it is just put the path annotation before the parameter we're sending. So now this node ID is going to be placed in the URL wherever we placed it. Also note that you can make this more complicated. You can say maybe some more nodes/node ID, then you can add something else, then you can add another path variable that's going to be called something else, and you can basically have this more and more complex as much as you want it. But since our API is very simple, we're going to have it like this. Okay, now with the create node. If you remember from one of our first videos, we're not using the get method to create stuff, but we're using the post method. And when we're creating a node, we're also sending a request to a URL that's going to be API/notes. And we're sending a post request, but the node we're going to create is located in the body. So since it's API/notes, we're not adding anything to the path, but when we're sending a body, we need to annotate that body in the parameter. And we're just going to annotate it with a body annotation. Okay, and now the put method is going to have both of these things. It's going to have the route parameter or the path parameter, whatever we want to call it, and it's going to have a body parameter. Because when we're sending our update request, we're sending it to API/notes and then some dynamic note ID. But also in the body, we're sending some JSON. That's going to be, I believe, note title and note text. So we're going to add a put annotation here, but now we're going to add a path. So it's going to be path note ID, and also we must not forget to annotate the note ID parameter. And since we're sending a body to our update node, we're also going to add that. And for our delete node, it's going to be the same as the individual get node. We're hitting a certain path and we're sending a certain variable to that path. So let's just copy this, paste it, but change it to a delete method since we're actually deleting something from the API. And let's annotate our parameter with path. Okay, there's just one thing left to make our notes service be usable. We need to have a way to create it. So I'm just going to copy and paste something from the Chopper documentation. And as you can see here, it's just a static method that calls a private method, a private constructor that is also going to be generated through Chopper. We're going to see. So now we can remove a couple of these unnecessary parameters and we should be good. So now I'm going to run the command for code generation. Okay, and this is the command that we need to generate our code, and I'm just going to say enter. Okay, so after waiting for a minute or two, all of the code generation is done, and here is the output to that. And as you can see in our service, we do not have any errors. So if I open up the file explorer, you can see noteservice.chopper.dart, and now it has all of the generated code we need. So it composes the URL based on whatever we give it, and here it actually composes the URL out of variables that we defined and just generates some code for hitting the API. So that's very nice. Okay, so now what we need to do is actually make this Note service usable. So a couple of things that our Note service now does not really do or does not really have. So the first thing the Note service does not have is the base URL of the whole API. And if we go into the generated implementation, it just has the URL and it generates that URL with the client base URL. And right now the client is null because we're not passing anything in there. It's just going to be empty. So the base URL is technically going to be just /notes, and that's something we do not want. And another thing we have to make this service do is send our headers. And our headers are, most importantly, our API key. And right now our generated Chopper service does not do that. So I'm going to open up the file explorer, go to main.dart and see that there is an error when creating my notes service. And that's because this thing does not have a constructor because it's an abstract class. But no worries, we have our create method. So now we got rid of that error, but we still do not have the base URL and we still do not send any headers to our API. So the way we're going to fix it is if you look at the create method takes in a Chopper client. And if you take a look at that Chopper client, that client has everything we need. It has a base URL, it has a converter, which we're going to talk about a bit later, and it also has something called interceptors. And interceptors are something we're going to use to send our HTTP requests. So let me close this down and make a new Chopper client. So I'm just going to say Chopper client and call the constructor. So the first thing our constructor needs is the base URL, and we can provide it right here by going into our Notes service, and we can just copy paste the URL we have here, and we can remove this constant property since we're not using it anymore. So I'm going to paste it here, and now we have the base URL, and now the URL is going to be composed properly. But the second issue we have is how are we going to send headers to our API, and that's something we cannot do directly in the Notes service. But we can write something called an interceptor. And essentially what an interceptor is when we're trying to call something from our service. So let's just say CS here as Chopper service. When that Chopper service tries to call something, it's going to hit an interceptor we wrote. And that interceptor can modify the API request we're sending. So I for interceptor. And that interceptor can take the request and add some stuff to it or remove something from it. So it can modify the body, it can modify the headers, and then say, okay, this is ready to go to an API. And then from our interceptor, we're going to send a request to our API, and that's just how it's going to go. So interceptors are just a global way of handling common use cases. So this is mostly used when you need to add an authentication header to every request. So manually doing that is pretty boring, and that's what we did with our services we had previously. But now with Chopper, we cannot even do that. I mean, we can, it's just not convenient, and I'm not even going to show you that method because it's unnecessary for this. So the interceptor acts just like a middleman. It takes in a request, modifies it to its liking, and then sends it off. So now when we go back to our application, let's see how to make an interceptor work. So if we take a look here, it says that interceptor is an iterable, or basically a list of dynamic. And so we do not know what an interceptor technically looks like. like. But after looking at the documentation, we can determine that an interceptor can be just a function that returns a future of a chopper request. So let me just import whatever we need. And I'm just going to call it auth header interceptor, right? And the function that we declared here takes in a request, and that's pretty much it. This is going to be the interceptor. It's a function, an asynchronous function that returns a request, but also takes in a request. So as we said, interceptor takes in the request you're sending, modifies it a little bit, and then returns it, and then that request is sent to an API. So now we can take a request, and as you can see, dot, and it has everything. It has the base URL, the body, the headers, the parameters. So it has everything a request has. It has the URL, and you can basically take this request and modify it however you like. And what we're going to modify about this request is the headers, since the headers are most important. So first of all, I'm just going to create a variable of existing headers. So we're going to use the map from factory constructor to copy this map over. And then we're going to modify the headers by setting the API key to be this. And then we're going to put these headers back in the request by saying request is equal to request dot, and then the request class has something called copy with, which is going to take the entire request, copy it into a new request, but with some parameters you add. So we can add whatever we want, the base URL, the body, the encoding, but what we're concerned about are headers. So we can say dot headers, and that's the headers variable we just modified. And the final thing we have to do is just return that request. And another thing I forgot to do is to make this method async. So that's pretty much it. That's everything an interceptor does. Takes a request, you can modify it however you want, and then you just ship it off. And so for this to actually work, we just have to take this function and paste its name here. And that's everything you need. And also just note, I'm doing all of this setup in the main.dart file, but if you're doing kind of an actual project, you most likely should just split this into its own file just so you're sure. But anyway, we have solved most of the problems that we had until now. But one thing that we have to solve as well is actual conversion of JSON data to our objects, to lists of our classes, to our classes, and that type of stuff. Because Chopper does not automatically work with custom classes, it just returns maps of string dynamic, which is not at all convenient because then we run into the same problem of having to convert everything manually. But what Chopper allows us to do is to create something called converters. And a converter is basically a class that will take in some data and spew out some different data. So we can just take in our maps and convert them to regular classes. And we can also take our regular classes and convert them to maps, because we also need to do that when sending something to the API. Chopper is not going to automatically parse the class we send, but we have to do it ourselves. And that can also be done with a global converter. And you can use just one converter, you cannot use multiple. So now the only problem we have is writing that converter, which can be kind of difficult. I honestly don't even know how I would do it. And in Dart, also, you cannot automatically go into a specific class like notes for listing and just take in all of the properties and parse them to a map automatically. You would have to do it in some kind of a manual way. But the good thing is we have JSON serializable. And in the Chopper documentation, there is a pre-written converter called JSON serializable converter, which will take a class that's JSON serializable and call its toJSON method on it. So that can be helpful. And for me, that one from the documentation didn't work out of the gate, so I have to modify it a little bit. But I'm just going to copy paste that thing here, and you shouldn't even worry about it because it really doesn't matter. You can just copy it from me and use it in your apps. So I'm going to create a new file called JSON serializable converter.dart and copy and paste that converter over here. Okay, so this is the JSON serializable converter class, and it has some logic for decoding a map and converting it into an object, for taking a list of maps and converting those into a list of objects. So that's basically everything we need. The only error we have here is the resource error. That class is missing, and I'm just going to add it into our models folder. I'm going to call it resource error.dart. And I'm also going going to copy paste that, and that's also going to be a JSON serializable thing. So now we have pretty much everything we need. I'm just going to have to run the build method one more time so we generate our resource error file. Okay, so after waiting for a minute, we have our generated class and we're good. So that's pretty much it for making this class. And also, if you don't understand what I'm talking about when I'm talking about converters, it really doesn't matter. You can just stick this in your app and not worry about it. So we can go now to main.dart and actually use this converter. So I'm going to uncomment this line and add a constructor for our converter, import it. And now we have to pass in a map of type and JSON factory. And we're going to do that using curly braces. And what are factories actually? A factory is just a method that's going to let you know you have a type of, for example, note. How do I convert this note from JSON to a actual note? And the key of that map is going to be the name of the type, or actually the type. It's going to be, if we're converting a note, it's going to be a note, note dot from JSON. And I'm going to remove the function call. So that's basically it. We're just saying the way you create a note. So the way you create a note is by using this method. And to create a note for listing, you create that by using note for listing dot from JSON. And remove the function call. And that's pretty much it. So, but now you notice that we're having some errors. It says that the getter from JSON is not defined for type note. So yeah, you cannot call a factory constructor like this, unfortunately. So we're going to have to change our factory constructors to actually just be static methods. And in that way that will work. So we can just say, instead of factory note dot, we can just say static from JSON, and that will be it. And let's also go into our note for listing, replace this with static, and it even makes stuff a bit simpler now that I look at it. And now we do not have any more errors for this. Okay, so we're 2/3 on the way there. We took our NoteService and we refactored it to be compliant with Chopper, and we generated a class. We set up our Chopper client and our converter and our interceptors. So now the only thing left is to handle all of the errors that we now get in our code, in our view code. So the main errors we're getting are these ones based on API response. So we just have to completely wipe out API response from our views and just use the regular response class. So I'm just going to remove that and I'm going to import a response class. And watch out, because there are two response classes. There is one in Chopper and one in http.dart. We want the Chopper one. Okay, now that we added that, we have a lot more errors. So let's start fixing them one by one. So API response.error message, let's just say an error occurred, for example. And this thing, we can actually make it better. We can say if API response dot is successful and add an exclamation mark here for not. So if API response is not successful, then show the error. And now we have all of these dot data. And this is one thing that's different from our API response. In API response, I called the body that was returned data, but in the Chopper's response class, it's actually called body. So we can just replace dot data with dot body, and that will fix most of the errors we have here. Okay, and now there is just one more error left, and we can just select this and remove it, and that will fix everything. So that's pretty much it. The only things we did is we set data to body and we removed these little error things. Okay, and now we have to go to note modify.dart, go back here, and then again we have to replace dot data with dot body. So let's go find, replace, and just say replace all. And now there are 3 errors left related to error messages. So we can just remove this, then we can scroll down to another error, remove this, and also result.error. That's not right. We have to say if result is not successful, and also here it's the same error. If result is successful, so if not successful, and I believe that should be it for the refactoring. Now our app should run without any errors. Let me just check. Yeah, so now that I run the app, everything should be the same. It's just that we have a lot less code here. So let me press F5 and that will run it on my device. Okay, so the app is now up and running and it should load our notes without a question. Okay, and we got an error. It says the getter notes note ID was called on null. So I think I kind of know where this problem is coming from, and it's in the note list part. So it's over here. I'm going to just put a breakpoint here and restart the app. Okay, and now the app is restarted and we hit the breakpoint. So at this point we should already have the list of notes in our body thing. But as you can see, it says there's a list of 3 items, or basically a list of 3 notes, but they're all null. And the reason they're all null, I'm showing you this because this will most likely happen to you. It happens to me every time and I always have this issue. It's something with converting the map to an actual note for listing. So we have to see what's the problem there. Okay, so I realized what's the issue here. So I forgot to do this. I actually forgot this. That's why I'm saying it happens to me every time. This cannot be a static function. It needs to be a static variable that is a function. I don't know why. And I also know this kind of doesn't make sense. So let me just show you. It needs to be a static const, which means a constant thing. And that has to be equal to this function declaration. Not the function call, just the function declaration. So we have to remove this. And then it will work. So static const from JSON. So an actual constant variable is equal to this function declaration. I don't, doesn't make any sense, but it is what it is. So we can go to our note.dart and also do the same thing. Static const, remove the parentheses here, remove this thing and make it into an equal sign, and remove this. So now when I save all of the files and restart the app, this should work. Okay, so now when I restarted the app, it should work. But when I go into the edit note screen, you can notice that these fields are not being pre-filled. And that's something I messed up and I'm not sure what I did wrong. So I'm just going to put a breakpoint here and see what's happening. So I'm going to go back into this screen, and it seems I don't even hit a breakpoint. So let me go back, open this up. Okay, and then I hit the breakpoint. And oh, we didn't check. We said if response.error, and that's where it probably crashed. So we need to change this to if response is not successful. Let me also see if that happens anywhere else. Error. No. So when I save this and rerun this again, then it should work. Okay, so now that the app is up and running again, we can test this thing once again. So we can go into hello. And yeah, it's going to fill this out. Let's just try to update this to see if it works. Hello, update. Submit. And okay, now there's another error that we made. So I'm going to shut off the app just to show you what we messed up. So let's go into the NoteService. So yeah, here we're saying that we want a responsive Boolean, but that was actually with the old thing that we had. We made it custom so that it returns a Boolean. But here the API is not actually returning the Booleans. So we can just remove these type parameters and then all of this will work. So now that I restart the app, I hope that everything should work proper. Okay, so the app is up and running again. So now this should actually work. So let me go. Okay, it updated our note. Let's try to update it once again and see if everything goes smoothly. So update. Hello, update again. Say submit. Oh, I forgot to generate the code automatically. Yeah. So I forgot to generate the chopper code, so it was running with the old interface. So I'm just going to run that once again. Okay, so now that this is done, I believe I can just go in and restart the app through hot restart. So let's do that. And yeah, the app is up and running again. So let's go into our note, say hello, update again, say submit. Yeah, your note was updated, say okay. And if we go back, and yeah, it says hello, update again. Let's create a new note just to see if it works. My new chopper note, and let's say submit. Yeah, it says your note was created. Let's go back and see if it actually exists. And yeah, and now let's delete that note. Are you sure you want to delete this note? Yes. And string is not subtype of future or bool. Okay, this is another thing that I did not do well when replacing the data with body. So here we just need to return is successful. Save and go further. Okay. And now the app is frozen, so I'm just going to restart it through hot restart, and it should work once I restart it. Okay, now it's loading. Yeah, it deleted the note, but let's delete this one and see if it works. Yes, and yeah, but there is some type of an error that occurred. Oh, this is the problem. We say if the delete result is not equal to null, and if delete result dot is successful is equal to false. Okay, and now this should work. Let me restart the app again. Okay, it restarted, and let me delete this node now. Delete, yes. It still says an error occurred. I'm not sure what happened. Let's see. Let me delete this one as well. Yes, and see what happens. So we're sending the note ID, we're getting a result, and that result is successful. And now when we go if delete result is not equal to null and delete result is not successful. Oh, so I got the logic messed up. I'm sorry. So we have to go here and change this here. Okay, so now the app is going to work. Okay, now that we have restarted the app for a 1000th time at this point, let's test all the features together just to make sure they work. Let's go to add a new note, So let's say ABC, that's not C, ABCD, say submit, and it should create a note. Yeah, your note was created. Let's say okay, go back. And yeah, it has that note. So let's go into that note, say new note updated, say submit. Yeah, your note was updated, say okay, go back, and it was updated. Let's now swipe to delete this, say yes. I'm going to remove the breakpoint, say continue, and yeah, it was deleted successfully. So that's pretty much it for this video. If you enjoyed this video and this entire course, if it helped you, like the video and subscribe to the channel. And that's pretty much it. I'll see you next time.